Gojo's departure from the Jujutsu Kaisen story has spawned a multitude of theories that claim to know how he will return to the story. In this video, I go over all the relevant theories since chapter 248 dropped a pretty big statement that has people more hopeful than ever for his return. Obviously, there will be spoilers for the manga in this video. One of the more popular theories for that return has actually been around since he was sealed in the prison realm in the manga, where Gojo would have to sacrifice one of his 6 eyes to escape the prison realm in sort of a binding vow, or in this case, to return back to life. This theory only received more popularity as of recently after it being revealed by the author of the series, Gege that they don't like drawing 2 eyes. Stringing this together with the multiple depictions of Gojo having 1 eye and a fairly convincing case can be made for this theory. The theory only gets more convincing when taking into account the power of binding vows and their significance to the story. We've seen binding vows be made accidentally, made between 2 sorcerers easily, or even placed on curse techniques or people to make them significantly stronger. Mei even mentions that the quickest way to raise your level as a Jujutsu sorcerer is a binding vow with the trade-off being your life. This is something she uses quite frequently for her bird strike technique that only some of the strongest sorcerers to ever live have avoided, like Sukuna, Gojo, and Kenjaku. Some other examples of binding vows more specifically here, one formed fairly casually, is when Sukuna and Yorozu form a binding vow to let Yorozu do whatever she wants with Sukuna, granted she beats him in a fight. This binding vow is formed as easily as you or your friend would place a bet on a video game or your favorite sports team, and goes to show, like I've been reiterating, how casually they can be formed. Binding vows between 2 people though are different from binding vows formed with oneself, which is told to us by Kenjaku. When breaking a binding vow with oneself, the worst that can happen is losing what was gained. We can't take the risk. If we break the binding vow now, who knows what sort of retribution may come our way. Kenjaku even implies here that Mahito might turn into a caterpillar if not fulfilling his end of the binding vow. Binding vows between sorcerers are made with the interests of both parties, but we do know that the one proposing the binding vow can determine what the exact circumstances are. For example, Sukuna agreed to heal Yuji's heart and revive him for Yuji's cooperation in letting him roam free for a minute, provided he doesn't harm anyone during that minute. We know now Sukuna's words didn't include harming Yuji or Megumi, as he rips Yuji's finger off and force feeds Megumi a finger. We also know that this meant physical or bodily harm because he rendered Hana unconscious. Point being with this, that the one making the binding vow essentially makes the rules. What all this information tells us is the greater the trade-off, the bigger the reward. Binding vows can be formed casually on the brink of death, and the person proposing the binding vow makes the rules. The backbone of this theory is obviously saying that a 6 eye is equivalent or sufficient exchange for returning Gojo back to life. Gojo, who's on the brink of death or already dead, could make it, and most importantly that Gojo wants to come back to life. Given Gojo's extensive knowledge of Jujutsu and the fact that he left a few things unfinished, you'd think if he wanted to come back to life, this is something that would have already happened. It was confirmed in chapter 236 that Gojo did indeed die, so if he made a binding vow to return, why hasn't he yet? From what we've seen of Miwa and Sukuna's domain, both binding vows formed on oneself, the results are immediate. Miwa obtained the power she desired even though it got crushed by Kenjaku, and Sukuna's domain receives a range boost as a trade-off for having an escape route. It is possible due to the nature of Gojo's binding vow that it's going to take longer for it to actually become active, but to be honest, I'm not really buying that. Miwa, for example, wanted to put everything into her strike, her present and future, all into one sword swing, even if it meant she would never swing her katana again. She essentially condensed her entire lifespan of power into her katana and the time it took her to swing her sword, and if that's the case and a binding vow can do something like that so quickly, I don't see why Gojo wouldn't be back already. The next thing is, does Gojo actually want to come back? Gojo in the afterlife seemed extremely content with his death for the fact that he got to go all out and he died to someone strong instead of a disease or old age. At the end of his dream sequence, he even goes as far as to say he hopes what he's experiencing isn't a dream. In a way, Gojo was free when he finally died, so while the theory may be well researched and have a sturdy foundation because of the power system, I don't think it's all that likely to be the case, but Jujutsu Kaisen is an ongoing manga. At any point in time, we could receive a chapter that Gojo has changed his mind and wants to head north and get his life back. It's also revealed in the latest chapter as of the time of recording this video that Gojo's body is missing. If his death was a medical death, meaning his heart only stopped beating, if Shoko can briefly revive him, maybe that could give him sufficient motivation to make a binding vow, as he'd still need the lower half of his body. But for now, I don't think Gojo really wants to come back to life, which leads me to the next theory, which is far more sinister and right up Gege's alley. That's if Kenjaku gets Gojo's body. Unless you read the fan book, there's no real way to know of this quote, but Gege was actually asked if Kenjaku had ever considered stealing Toji or Gojo's body. Gege's response is Gojo is impossible. To put it simply, you can't kill him. Toji wouldn't be impossible to take over, but there's a risk of Toji's heavenly restriction and Kenjaku's curse technique clashing when he takes over the body and causing some kind of malfunction. So taking over either of those two doesn't make much sense. The part that's relevant is obviously the opening statement, Gojo is impossible. To put it simply, you can't kill him. This theory gets its legs off the ground with the simple fact that this statement is no longer true. The fanbook only covers up to chapter 136, so it obviously has no knowledge of Gojo's death, meaning it is now possible for Kenjaku to take over Gojo's body. There are a couple of things that make me believe Kenjaku has no interest in obtaining the 6 eyes though, and I think I'm fairly correct on this, so hear me out. We learned from Tengen that in the past, Kenjaku has lost to a 6 eyes user other than Gojo. Keep in mind, the guy has been alive for more than 1,000 years. This happened on 2 separate occasions, so aside from Gojo, Kenjaku is well aware that the 6 eyes possess greater power than himself or what he's capable of. When thinking of other ways to deal with the 6 eyes sorcerer, Kenjaku opts to unalive one while they are still a baby, and since that didn't work out for his whole fate breaking plan, he started opting to seal them away like what we saw with Gojo in Prison Realm. I think if he wanted to obtain the 6 eyes, he would have done it already. There's also the problem with the ending of the manga. At this point, Gojo and Sukuna can't be matched by anyone already, so if both of those bodies are on the same side, there is very little chance the good guys would be able to get the upper hand in this fight at all. This doesn't outright debunk the theory, of course, because as we all know about Gege, they love giving the bad guys the upper hand in Jujutsu Kaisen. But while this story is more prone to it, I do think this manga is going to end with the good guys winning. The bad guys having the hopeless upper hand has happened in Dragon Ball countless times, it's happened in Naruto, it's happened in Bleach, it's a trope and JJK is having its go at the trope at the moment. There is also the possibility that Kenjaku is, well, finished already. We just saw Yuta cut his head off not too long ago, and the way Kenjaku is talking on the ground here, it doesn't seem like he plans to come back to life. He's even talking about how his will be inherited and how he hates to leave so much unfinished. Even currently, Yuta has shown up in Shinjuku to fight Sukuna, and I doubt he'd leave without making sure Kenjaku was gone for good. The way they talk about it as well, Sukuna now holds the power to activate the merger whenever he wants to, and that was Kenjaku's insurance plan in case he never got to activate it. So will Kenjaku come back? It's certainly possible. Will it be inside of Gojo's body? That's also possible, but like I've been reiterating throughout this section, I don't really think it's all that likely. One thing that could make it narratively satisfying is if you look at it from the perspective that Kenjaku getting Gojo's body because it wasn't properly disposed of the same way Geto's body wasn't properly disposed of, and how Gojo and Geto are best friends and he's toying with Gojo's body the same way he toyed with Geto's. This also creates a maximally powerful sorcerer, someone with both limitless and cursed spirit manipulation. That's an insane combination to think about. Also, to nail this home and move on to the next theory, I have 2 more things to bring up. I realize Kenjaku is very good at reverse curse technique or RCT, but saying Kenjaku could pull off the feat of regrowing Gojo's entire lower body is a bit much in my opinion. Gojo, Sukuna, and Hikari all have extremely powerful RCT, and a feat like that even seems crazy for them, much less so on Hikari, but you get what I'm saying. The second thing is Gojo knows RCT and didn't do it. And if you don't know, cursed energy is nurtured in the stomach, then flows to your other body parts. Positive energy, which fuels reverse curse technique, is made by multiplying that cursed or negative energy against itself, and that happens in the brain. What I'm getting at is if Gojo got cut through his stomach, then his body might be unsalvageable by itself. So he or Kenjaku is going to need help healing it. And while Gojo might have someone to help him in Shoko or Yuta, which I'll talk about in a second, Kenjaku doesn't have that same luxury. So much like the last theory, I'm going to conclude that this one is unlikely but certainly possible. This next theory is a newer one and more so on the prediction side if you ask me. Shoko healing Gojo is made possible solely by chapter 248. In this chapter we learn that Ui has been teleporting away the wounded sorcerers to Shoko. The important thing about this though is that they went and retrieved Gojo's corpse. When they actually retrieved it is very important because it could knock this theory down in terms of likelihood, but it is still unknown at the time, so I'll explain why. If you pay attention to the end of chapter 236, Gojo's body is very close to Sukuna and Sukuna turns around to face Kashimo. Sukuna doesn't seem to move after he does that and just waits for his curse tool to be delivered and for Kashimo to approach him. When this happens, tons of ice fall on what would be Gojo's body and whatever was frozen in the ice aside from the curse tool because there's tons of rubble behind Sukuna. If Gojo's body was retrieved before all of this fell on him, then his body is probably still salvageable. But if that's not the case, it's likely got crushed even further, making this less likely. Nonetheless, assuming he was gotten before that crushed him, Shoko isn't regenerating an entire lower half. Shoko couldn't even bring back Yuji's heart when Sukuna had ripped it out at the detention center. From here, you could take this two different ways, and they don't necessarily contradict each other, so they might both be true. One is that Shoko, like everyone else over the time skip, received an upgrade in her abilities, meaning her healing is now more potent than it was when Yuji had his heart ripped out. Or two, Shoko will simply start stitching together Gojo's body with RTT, essentially helping him along instead of doing all the work herself. Number one does have some backing since Shoko was allegedly able to heal Hikari's entire arm after he made the binding vow in the Kashimo fight. This could even tie back into the first theory I went over, with Gojo losing one of his 6 eyes in return for coming back to life. If binding vows are a give and take thing, then losing one's 6 eyes to return to life from that mass amount of damage might have been too much, but in this scenario it's not. This theory for a few reasons is the one I believe is the most likely to happen if Gojo is to return to Jujutsu Kaisen. It ties into the theme of loneliness for the story and Gojo's character. Gojo getting help from Ui, Kirara, and Shoko to come back to life after living the majority of his life in isolation, receiving little help from everyone else because he can do everything himself. I'm sure you've had that explained to you enough times and it's not all too relevant to the video, so let's move on to the next theory. This next one is more like a generalization or hints, I guess you could say, because it sort of bypasses being a revival theory and just comes to the conclusion Gojo is more than likely to come back to life based on the manga that inspired Gege Akutami themselves. So while these things don't point to a specific method, they definitely point to one conclusion, that being Gojo's inevitable return. For this, I want to make it clear that Gege is heavily inspired by Togashi as a whole, not just Hunter x Hunter, but his other manga Yu Yu Hakusho as well. One of the main things taken from Hunter x Hunter is present in the fight between Gojo and Sukuna, and it's a very specific part from Chrollo versus Hisoka, or actually it's a few parts, but whatever, I'm rambling. Chrollo and Sukuna are similar in this fight, having a plan they are trying to enact to bring their opponent down. When those plans start to line up nicely, a very specific thing happens to both Hisoka and Gojo, that being them losing one of their arms. After this act is done, there is a panel drawn very similarly of both Chrollo and Sukuna who say good and very good respectively. At the end of the fight, Hisoka is no longer alive but uses his bungee gum technique to bring himself back to life with what he calls nin that gets stronger after passing away. That part is very important because in chapter 247, we just got a statement about curses getting stronger after passing away, and we're led to believe this was in reference to Higuruma's executioner sword, but chapter 248 shows that not to be true. While it is possible that this was just a feint to subvert expectations for the reader, I don't think that's mutually exclusive from it also being a possible hint that something like this could be used to bring someone back to life. In this case, Gojo. Just like what happened in Hunter x Hunter. This other example I'm not too well versed in, and it's not something I came up with on my own like the Hunter x Hunter one, but it's from a manga that I will not even try to pronounce, where there's a character who dies in a similar way to the way Gojo is drawn on the floor, who is later brought back to life. Now, on to our final theory. This one has more to do with story implications that Gojo will come back based on some hints thrown into chapter 236, mainly to do with lotus flowers and going north. This theory, I should also mention, likely requires an understanding of Buddhism that admittedly I don't have. So if you understand the religion and could make more sense of what I'm saying in the comments, feel free to do so. So let's address firstly the title of the chapter, which is just Heading South. Most people have chose to believe that this title is in reference to Gojo, but I think it's the title of the chapter because that's the focus at the time, and it's the only one we have a direct reference of in the manga so far, that being Nanami. While of course it is possible for Gojo to have chosen to go south, the fact of the matter is the manga isn't finished yet. Within the next 4 or so chapters, we could get a chapter where Gojo is telling Nanami how he wants to go north and not be like him. And there's actually something in the chapter to point to this. If you look at the position of their seating, Nanami and Gojo are facing away from one another. Nanami, who chose south, and Gojo sitting on the other side facing the other direction. I think a piece of evidence that makes this fairly convincing is who is also facing north with Gojo, that being Geto. Geto is someone who has, in his life, already chosen to head north and become someone new back in Hidden Inventory when he decided to be the worst curse user the world had ever seen up to that point. Nanami, being someone who self-admittedly chose south, could be the only evidence you need for the first part of the theory, that just being Gojo heading north. After this explanation from Nanami, Gojo says, "I see," as if it's not something he knew beforehand. This is where we'll start getting into Buddhism, with Gojo's birth name, Satoru Gojo, and what it means. The base of his first name, Satoru, is a Japanese Buddhist term called Satori, which means enlightenment. Within Buddhism, immediately after Buddha's birth, he took 7 steps north, and with each step a lotus flower blossomed. Switching back to the chapter briefly, the same amount of lotus flowers bloom in chapter 236 when Gojo is talking about how you can make a flower bloom but can't tell it to understand you. The fact Buddha did this as he was being born and Nanami is talking about becoming someone new makes it seem like this could be Gojo's second birth and when he becomes truly enlightened. This does go deeper. Like I said, you kind of have to understand Buddhism for some of it, and this is just the part I felt comfortable saying because I think I got it right, but I'd recommend looking into the actual translation of Kashimo's name yourself and what the purple cloud means and how it all fits into this theory. My only real issue with this theory would be the odd spot that the lotus flowers are placed. It seems like if this was for Gojo coming back, these flowers would be placed around that time, but currently they're all just on a random panel, and they all aren't in the same direction. If this was truly meant to mirror Buddha, each flower should be in a line, at least the way I understand it. To also talk about whether or not Gojo was having a dream quickly, I don't believe he was because Nanami is telling Gojo things only Nanami could know, like how Haibara showed up just before his death in front of Yuji, and also Gojo's reaction to Nanami's conversation with Meimei. All in all, there is a solid chance Gojo could come back, but I'll honestly just wait and see.